So what I want to talk about today is really analytics infrastructure and building a foundation for learning resource analytics. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, Jim Clough, he's the lead technical architect for the Learning Registry project, and John Brecht, who's done a lot of development on it as well. All of us are at SRI International, and we've been funded by the U.S. Department of Education to work on the Learning Registry. There's also been funding from the U.S. Department of Defense. But I also want to acknowledge the Learning Registry open source community. It's absolutely a fabulous group of people. And I want to give a special shout out to the National Science Digital Library. Some of the slides I'll be showing are courtesy of them. And also a development group in Northern California called Navigation North that's done a lot of really good early demonstrations that show the power of the Learning Registry. So why do we want to worry about learning resources? Let's start with that question. Well, we find ourselves in a situation where we have these stovepipe repositories that hold data, and they can share data among the different repositories through pipes like OAI, PMH, you might be familiar with if you're in the repository business. But what we found over the years is that really the metadata that is supposed to describe these and supposed to help find them really is growing pretty stale. People either don't update it when it's time to, or they don't even add it at the outset. That's a pretty common occurrence. There's this concept of data exhaust. We heard digital trace earlier today. This idea that as you move through and interact with different systems on the internet, you create this exhaust trail. And what we're trying to address in the Learning Registry is that data exhaust really isn't powering anything. It's wasted. Learning resources as a consequence are languishing on the shelf. The long tail of finding learning resources isn't really being realized. And also, data is locked in and locked down often. So let's look at this idea of a stovepipe repository. What could it look like instead? Instead of this stovepipe repository, we could have data that's shared in the open, that is aggregated, that's amplified, that's used for analytics. This idea of metadata growing stale, well, maybe one alternative to that, to trying to whip people into getting their metadata updated, is to instead enrich the data, enrich the discussion with social usage data, contextualized attention metadata, it's also been called, or paradata, which really adds a lot more depth and a lot more nuance to the metadata. This data exhaust, this wasted effort that's out there, this wasted data, we could actually harness that. We could collect it and use it to power a kind of a social life for learning resources. Learning resources being languishing on the shelf. Instead, we could have a learning resource living in a rich ecosystem. This is what we're driving for with the Learning Registry. Data locked in and locked down. This is where I make the obligatory Facebook comment about data being locked in and locked down. Instead of that data being locked in, we'd like to look at ways that we can democratize the use of data, especially because it's for educational purposes, or liberate the data. So let's look at how the Learning Registry helps share data in the open for aggregation, amplification, analysis, and so on. Other applications to be determined. So the Learning Registry is a pretty simple concept. It's a distributed system that permits sharing of metadata about learning resources and also paradata. It's been developed through an open community process that's been engaging learning resource creators, publishers, including commercial publishers, curators of data, so the people who bring you the digital libraries and the repositories, and also data consumers. The Learning Registry is a simple network that lets you store and forward data about learning resources. And it's important to point out that it's not someplace you go log in. It's not a destination website. It's not a search engine. It's not even a repository. But it's this registry of information upon which you can build these diverse set of user services. So let's look at how we can enrich learning resource data with paradata to add nuance to metadata. So here's an example of where we have a content provider, which is the U.S. NASA Space Agency. We have NSDL, a National Science Digital Library, which is a repository. We have a teacher portal, Career and Technical Education Online. And in the middle, we have this data exchange called the Learning Registry. And it's a data, assertions are stored in a timeline. You know, we do something day 1, we do something day 2. So in this scenario that I'm painting here, we can see that NASA has a learning resource, the Mars rover, that they think is particularly interesting. And so they tell the Learning Registry they have this resource available. NSDL picks that up and surfaces that information to one of its users. A teacher looks at that using the NSDL repository and says, I like that resource, I favorite that resource. That information can then get fed back into the Learning Registry, so that data isn't stovepiped into that NSDL repository. On the other side, CTE Online, a teacher can be looking at, can surface that resource and be looking at it and say, this aligns well to some Common Core standard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that alignment activity, not anything special with the Learning Registry, it's just something that they're, as part of their task that they're doing, and that alignment can be asserted into the Learning Registry so that then other people can see that there's something important about that Mars rover animation. And then on top of all that data and all that exhaust that's being collected, there's different services that can be created, and those are indicated along the bottom. So you could have a service provider who does aggregation over the ratings data, does aggregation over the alignment data, does some social network analysis among the different people who are actually making these assertions. So that was an example of how we can get metadata out of the stovepipe. So let's look at now ways that we can collect this data exhaust. I gave some examples of that already. This is a slide that's from the National Science Digital Library, again, courtesy of NSDL, that talks about the different kind of usage data that they found their teachers of their repository thought would be most interesting to collect. So I think some of these should be very familiar, and one of the things I'm really interested in seeing as I've gone to talks here this past couple days is what the vocabulary is for these important kinds of paradata or usage data, and how do we collect these and then make them useful for learning purposes. So we imagine that also we have resources that can be more well-developed or can live in a richer ecosystem than they do now. Often in education, a particularly hot resource will find itself living in many different places. It might be in the NSDL, it might be in NASA's website, it might be in OER Commons, and different things are happening with the same resource at those different locations. What we can do with the Learning Registry is pool all of that activity and show it as a resource paradata profile. Now this is a mock-up, this is not an actual demonstration, but you can see here over on the left, there's a dynamic summary that talks about what's been happening with this resource, how many times has it been rated, how many times has it been viewed. We can see the actual resource in the middle. And on the right side, we're highlighting some of the particular places where activity has been happening with it. On CTE Online, we had some alignment activity going on. There's been some tagging that's been done, that's been picked up in the Learning Registry, that's indicated in the lower left side, lower right side. So that shows how these, using Learning Registry data, these resources can live in this rich ecosystem. So now let's look at ways that we might liberate this data once it's put into the Learning Registry. So this is an example application that was developed by Jim Clow based on some early work by Pat Lockley. And what it is a Chrome plugin that will intercept the results of the Google search. And if the URL that's returned by Google is something that the Learning Registry knows about, the plugin will query the Learning Registry, find that information, and then surface that information in the Google search results. And this is legal, I'm told. We looked at the terms of service of Google, so we're okay with it. So what's interesting here is that the data that would normally, this is alignment data, that would normally be living in, say, this CTE Online system, and if you were searching for that alignment data, you'd have to actually go to their website and find it, do the search. You'd have to go to all these different websites. When we pool this data into the Learning Registry, we can actually surface it in interesting ways. Another way of doing that is for another portal. Here's another California teacher portal called Brokers of Expertise that is taking the data that's been worked on at CTE Online and actually surfacing the Learning Registry information. This is a working demo. So that people can see kind of what's the social activity that's happening around this resource that they're looking. And this is made possible by the fact that we can pool this information. Otherwise, Brokers of Expertise would have to connect up to NSDL, would have to connect up to CTE Online, and so on and so forth. So there are many different kinds of learning resource systems that can be connected into the Learning Registry network. We have an open source APIs for publish and consume. There's a GitHub repository that's mentioned in the paper that you can go look at. We are working with learning object repositories, teacher portals, search tools. We're just starting to work with learning management system. There's a lot of activity data around resources being used by teachers, authoring systems there that we're really interested in. And then the states, in the United States, there's a move on some of the states to do these instructional improvement systems, and they're actually publishing and consuming, or planning to publish and consuming from the Learning Registry. So this is an example of a kind of a picture of the about 400,000 resources that we have now in the Learning Registry. These are just metadata resources. I don't have a picture of the paradata resources, but you can see that there's a rich set of science resources, primarily because we've got a lot of information from NSDL, but also some European Union resources and others as well. So I want to give a little bit of a technical background on the Learning Registry just to finish up here. It's built on a document distribution system called CouchDB. It's very easy to set up new nodes and replicate and pull data out of the system. It's metadata agnostic. We're not saying that you have to use a particular kind of metadata. We use a little envelope that we put around your metadata and then insert it into the Learning Registry. The social usage metadata is modeled on this NSDL Compara. We've had some discussions with the contextualized activity metadata folks and also activity streams. So it's been a merge, and it's also in a changing standard. It's not, standard was the wrong word. It's really more a community accepted methods of describing paradata that we're working toward. It also uses, and this is both a challenge for us, uses the URL to uniquely identify a resource. It doesn't work 100% of the time. We also have the submitter identity verified by digital signature to prevent spam, but we're also interested in using that for people to start to develop reputations for publishing into the Learning Registry and then creating trust networks. So I wanted to end by talking a little bit about what some of the potential applications, the services that we can build on the Learning Registry. So we can think about doing relationship mining, where we're looking at people based on their attention to resources, what institutions or groups of people or individuals have shared or curated or favored or rated or commented upon the same resources. We can certainly look at user experience and give feedback to the people who are developing learning resources about the kinds of ratings, and they don't have to go look at all these different sites to find out what people think about their resources. Obviously, user profiling is another obvious application. And then we're also interested, because there is a time aspect to the Learning Registry data, there is a kind of a Twitter feed aspect to it, to try to look at trends in attention to different kinds of resources. Is there some way that we can say something's trending or something's fallen off out of favor? So recommendations also, we can do clustering of users, building social network graphs among people. And then feedback, I think, is really important for the long term. who is adapting your work, who's using them, and eventually we'd like to see this cause this widespread sharing of learning resources and really getting the learning resources to the learners at the appropriate time. So I'd like to thank some of the slides here are courtesy of Steve Midgley, he's at the U.S. Department of Education, and Dan Rehack, who's our DoD representative at ADL. He's a technical advisor. And then Susan Van Gundy, who is formerly at UCAR NSDL. That's it. Over a little bit. Thank you.
So one of the pieces of metadata that, or I guess data that interests me personally most is usage statistics. So you can do something like item response theory to figure out if something's a good question or a bad question, how difficult it is, how much time learners spend on it. But as you try to share that data, you get into student privacy concerns because that data is actual usage information. And if I'm searching for information, I'd really like to have that data. But on the other hand, things like FERPA prevent me from providing that data to a common registry. Have you kind of thought about how to handle that trade-off?
So privacy data in general, I think, not just for assessment information, is really critical. We have thought about putting people in, having people identify into groups. So for example, when somebody's doing alignment, I'll talk about alignment data because we've thought about that more. When someone's aligning a resource to a standard, if they're state authorized, that has more weight. If they're district authorized, it has less weight. If they're just a teacher who's using it in their classroom lesson planning, it has less weight. So it doesn't matter so much who the individual was, but what their function is in doing that, that alignment. Now, in the case of assessment, it's a little bit different because you might have an individual, and if you gave demographic data about that individual, say they were part of a, a specific age group, or they were at a particular location, you could actually determine who that person was in some cases, right? Mm-hmm. So we haven't solved that problem, but we're thinking about the problem more from the idea of would people want to surface information to show, to establish a reputation, for example, or to give weight to the action that they've done, like an alignment.
Okay.
Did that answer? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think it's really exciting, all this work you've just described. And I see a huge list of potential applications. Which is the one that makes you most excited?
I think the one where people are willing to reveal who they are and establish a reputation by asserting things into the learning registry. I mean, my dream goal would be to have people put their LinkedIn profile information into the learning registry and then have that be associated. There's nothing to be ashamed of when you're commenting or rating. It just makes the data that much better. So I think that's one of the directions that we're going to be pushing in is looking at reputation and trust networks. We're also interested in instrumenting things, so building little widgets that anyone can take and put on their website or their portal or repository, and you push a button and it pushes something to the learning registry. That's another thing we're really interested in.
How granular are you thinking this might become? I mean, it's a federated resource. I mean, you could imagine this is, as granular as to the person, so.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's granular to the person, but also the other granularity problem is, do I submit something to the learning registry every time someone does an action, or do I queue that up, do a summary, and submit it overnight? The data in the learning registry will expire, so the idea, that's one of the things we're experimenting with, so it is a timeline, and at some point data will decay and that will just pass out of the system, so there will be a need to refresh continually. So I think that's another granularity, and granularity of people too. Haven't really thought about that, because mostly we've had institutions who've been publishing as opposed to individual people.
One last quick one. I think this is very exciting too, using the social dynamics around resources. You flashed up a slide that showed the kinds of actions you're logging. Are they all basically fairly brief atomic actions like thumbs up, rate, tag? Or is there the facility for people to add more commentary, for example, about how they found the use of a resource when they tried it out on their students, etc.? So
one correction, I flashed up a slide of things that we could, not that we are currently capturing. That's knowing what we do about what happens on different portals. Those are the ones that seem to be the low-hanging fruit. And as we instrument these different portals, we'll be able to collect that information. Longer comment data, we have thought about doing that. Then what would happen is, again, because this is an infrastructure, that information would sit in the learning registry until someone built a service to pull it out, to do sentiment analysis, to do some kind of textual analysis. So we're not making any claims in the learning registry about what we might do with that data. But there is a facility where we could collect that kind of commentary data. So the way that would come is a particular portal or object repository that actually has a user interface, because the learning registry isn't a website, would connect up to the learning registry and send us their paradata. Well, it would be social use. It would be social use where, depends on what you mean by social use. So if I'm a teacher and I'm sitting at my website and I'm looking for a learning resource and I find one and I say thumbs up, right? Then that portal submits it to the learning registry. Did that answer the question? The portal would know, and the portal would tell the learning registry. So there is some work for the different portals and the repositories they have to take an action to notify the learning registry that this happened. So they would understand the social use, if you will. Mm-hmm. Thank you.